Hi everyone, welcome to our panel discussion on trans inclusion in faith spaces. I'm Ruqayya Abdul-Majid. I identify as trans non-binary and I use they them pronouns. I'm of Muslim faith myself, so I'm very excited about this happening today and to be hosting it. So along with the other speakers today, I am a member of Giants, which is a network of trans activists working under the charity Gendered Intelligence. Gendered Intelligence is a trans-led UK charity who support trans people and aim to improve understandings of gender diversity. In this discussion, we'll be speaking to trans members of different faith communities and we'll be hearing about their experiences. I'd also like to introduce you to Max. Max will be interpreting the event for us today, so welcome, Max. Okay, so to get started, I'm going to introduce Jonathan. Jonathan is a queer, mixed-race trans man, a member of the New North London Synagogue in Finchley. He's passionate about radical Jewish learning, creating space for LGBTQ Jews and Jews of colour, and is currently co-chair of an independent Jewish prayer group. He works for a mental health charity and lives with his partner and cat. So welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, Ruqayya. Thanks for that introduction. Just checking that you can all see the slides. They should be up now. There we are. Fantastic. So if you just click on to the next slide, please. All of these Jewish people are trans. They are rabbis, activists, artists, educational leaders, community leaders. Judaism is diverse, interconnected, and has a strong LGBTQ community, which has existed for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years. And before I get into what Jewish tradition says about trans people, let me tell you a bit about my own story. What's the biggest decision that you've ever made in your life? For me, I've had two big moments that both involved me transitioning. The second big transition happened 3 years ago when I converted to Judaism after a few years of soul searching. And the first came 12 years ago when I came out to myself and my mum as a boy. Some trans men have always been masculine and a tomboy. They've always known that they were a boy inside. I had what you might call a very nondescript approach to gender as a kid. I was never pressured one way or the other by my mum. And so I was quite content to express myself however I wanted to and swung between the usual phases a teenager goes through. Then during my mid-teens, things started to change. My mum had serious depression and I was also struggling with anxiety and living at home. And so I went to a psychiatric hospital. Having those few months away, I could have some clarity on my life. What did I want to do in the future? Who did I see myself as? When I imagined myself in the future as a man, it felt right, it felt comfortable. Nothing concrete, but it gave me the motivation to research more about trans feelings, listen to trans elders' experiences, connect with others that were having the same feelings as I did. Interestingly, coming out as Jewish was more awkward than coming out as trans. My mum hadn't had the best relationship to organized religion, so I was concerned that she might equate Jewish to, I'm going to move to Stamford Hill. The moment of me telling her couldn't have been better. We'd gone to a Chinese restaurant and had ordered the most non-kosher looking platter you could imagine when I'd just told her I'd had a nice morning at the synagogue. Luckily, she took it better than I'd expected, and she was there with me at my conversion ceremony 1 year later. The moment I came out to my mum as trans, we cried, and that crying was a release of emotion that I'd been feeling for months. It was the beginning of my journey of transition, the start of us together struggling with something we didn't know much about. There were some questions that we had to answer. How could I come out of school? What could I do about my body? What could my future be like? Transitioning at the age of 16 meant I didn't have to wait to be happy. And being on hormones at 17 meant I ended up working and living, feeling secure in my body, celebrating, receiving my gender recognition certificate last year with a special celebration at my synagogue felt like completion. This really is the end of work that started in a bedroom in a hospital many years ago. So what does Jewish tradition say about trans people? Well, there have always been trans, intersex, and gender diverse people acknowledged in the Jewish manuscript, the Talmud.
Maybe that's just my computer, I'm not sure.
Oh, I can hear a little bit of feedback on the line, sorry. For trans people and all LGBTQ people, seeing ourselves in the text, especially in the Torah, what you might call the Old Testament, is a really important form of spiritual recognition and grounding. We get strength from learning about people like us. Having that direct connection with tradition and ability to interpret it through a trans lens empowers us. So here are a couple of texts that empower me as a trans person. If you click to the next slide, please. So this is the first text, and you might recognize this as the creation narrative. So it says, and God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So you probably might notice the use of plural pronouns. It seems that the first human is switching between male and plural, and even the rabbis acknowledge this gender fluidity. A commentary says, when God created Adam, he was created as both genders. The Midrash, a classical Jewish storytelling, adds that the first human being formed in God's likeness was an androgynous person. Rabbi Elliot Kukler, the first openly trans person to be ordained as a rabbi, says that this can teach us all bodies and genders are created in God's image, whether we identify as men, women, intersex, or something else. We also have a passage from the Mishnah. It says an androgynous, most likely someone who has both male and female reproductive organs, is similar to men in some ways, to women in other ways, and in some ways to both, in some ways to neither. Rabbi Meir says an androgynous is a gender category of his own, because the rabbis could not decipher if they were a man or a woman. What does this mean? It means the rabbis were commenting on something that happened in everyday life, things they came across, which they needed to figure out what to do with. From this inclusion in the Talmud, we can assume that the ancient rabbis were familiar with people living outside gender categories. They recognized that bodies and people sometimes can't be neatly classified, but that these trans and intersex people were actually part of everyday life. If you go on to the next slide, please. So we're going to bust some myths now. So the first one is the Bible has a prohibition on cross-dressing. So this is something from Deuteronomy 22:5. A woman should not wear man's clothing, neither shall a man put on a woman's garment. For whoever does these things is an abomination unto God. But actually, in the Talmud, which is a Jewish law code, a medieval commentator, Rashi, says the prohibition is limited to concealing identity for the purpose of adultery. So we can see now that the rabbinical commentators expanded what this meant. When we read scripture, time, context, and rabbinical interpretation, along with our own modern interpretation, really matter in Judaism. The next is changing your body goes against what God naturally gave you, which I think is something that many trans people of faith have had said to them. Ivri means to cross over, to transition, and that's the root of the word Hebrew. There's a recognition of transitioning in everyday life in Judaism. Havdalah is a ceremony marking separation between Shabbat and the rest of the week. God works with man in active creation. When God created the world, he gave the animals to man to name and the earth for man to steward. We're always working and changing things God made to make them whole, shalem in Hebrew. So I'm not destroying what God gave me. In my view, he started me off, and now I'm finishing his creation, and living authentically means I'm able to be comfortable as myself. It means I can live a better Jewish life. There's also a recognition of pikuach nefesh, which means saving a life as a Jewish principle. There's a recognition in many movements that gender transition is medically necessary by many rabbinical movements, and they've written policy on this issue. So Jewish communities aren't welcoming to trans people. Well, there are actually many trans rabbis that have been ordained by mainstream movements. CBST is also the largest LGBT synagogue, which is in New York, and they ran a trans convening last year, bringing together trans people, including many trans rabbis, to learn and teach. And Pride is celebrated in many Jewish communities, including my own. We've just had a whole Shabbat dedicated to LGBT Pride. My synagogue is also starting an LGBT group. If you click to the next slide, please. So how can we make sure we include trans people in Jewish spaces? So this is something from the group Polata Keshet. We came together I think it was at the end of last year, to create an inclusion guide on how you can include trans people in these spaces. So firstly, prepare a synagogue policy or a set of guidelines to support trans people coming out. As spiritual community leaders, there's a duty of care owed to congregants who may turn to their Jewish community and seek pastoral support. And even in Orthodox spaces, LGBT people and trans people exist. So it's not just progressive spaces, it's also Orthodox community as well, where these conversations are being had. Transition is one example of a modern milestone. Oh, sorry, let me just read this. Transition is one example of a modern milestone in some people's lives, and one that ritual can be reclaimed and recognized. And Jewish ritual is typically used to mark important points in an individual and community's life cycle. So I think transition can definitely be part of a synagogue celebration. And thirdly, Jewish institutions should be proactive and think about their positions on welcoming trans people. Not all community spaces can be fully trans-inclusive overnight. I've given the example of Orthodox spaces where there's a separation between genders, for example, in a synagogue. That might be more, it might be more difficult to include trans people in those sorts of spaces. But I think we can definitely establish positions on how trans Jews can engage in services. Some things are statutory rights, such as being able to use the correct bathroom. Some aspects of ritual and prayer are not. And I think once you've formalized your positions, you can create a trans inclusion statement outlining your stance and publicize it on your website or notice board. And I'd like to end by saying trans people in faith spaces aren't rhetorical. We are in our faith spaces, we exist in our spaces, and we are a reality.
Thank you so much for that, Jonathan. I think it was especially interesting to hear about the things that are already happening for you in Jewish spaces, for trans people in Jewish spaces. So can I just ask anyone who's watching, you're welcome to leave questions in the Facebook comments, and we're going to come to those at the end for all of the speakers or any individual speakers. Okay, so next up we have Alec. Alec is a trans man and a mental health social worker and lives in Coventry with his partner, housemate, and his one-eyed cat. Alec identifies as a Christian and grew up attending church every Sunday. He also used to be an active member of Diverse Church, which is an online community for LGBTQ Christians. He would love to see Christian and all faith spaces growing to become more accepting and inclusive of diversity of every kind, particularly towards the LGBTQ community, and he feels privileged to be able to play a small part in encouraging this inclusion today. So welcome, Alec. Okay, so we've just got a small technical difficulty we're going to sort out for Alec. Okay. So he is back with us now.
About that, everybody. So yeah, hello. It's a privilege to be able to speak to you all today and to be part of Pride Inside. Thank you to Rakaya and Jonathan for starting us off. And as Rakaya mentioned, my name is Alec and I use he, him pronouns. I identify as a trans man and I've done so for around 7 years. So I was born and raised in a Christian family and I grew up attending a Baptist church every Sunday. So for those that don't know, the Baptist community is an evangelical denomination of Christianity, or a community of Christianity that grew from the Church of England. One of the core differences between the two is that Baptists believe that when an adult commits their life to believing in and following Jesus, they are submerged fully underwater to represent being fully renewed in Christ. And that is exactly what I did when I turned 17. About 10 minutes before making this commitment as a Christian and being dunked, as some of us like to call it, I wore goggles and everything, I came out to my church This was as a gay woman at the time, as I didn't have the means of understanding or exploring my gender identity at this point. And now I know that this was the first step that I needed to take to realize who I was, to realize my trans identity. So whilst that community, that church community had known me since I was a child, I was allowed that day to be baptized. The conversations had afterwards about accepting LGBTQ people into the church were strained and difficult, and I was met with a similar kind of confusion every time I walked into a church after this. Coming out as transgender kind of complicated everything further, and I'm sure I'm not on my own in that experience. So I think it's fair to say that this barrier to being accepted in church has impacted on my own relationship with God sometimes, and having a relationship with God is kind of a key component of the Christian faith. So in all honesty, part of my decision to do this today was to try and reconnect with my own faith by figuring out what the Christian response to welcoming trans people into the church should actually look like, and hopefully encourage this kind of genuine inclusion to become a reality. So some of the concepts of inclusion in faith that Jonathan talked about earlier can be found in parts of the Christian Bible as well, and he's done a great job of discussing these. So thank you, Jonathan. Rather than recapping what's already been said, I want to start a brief exploration of trans inclusion in Christianity by looking to Jesus. So he's our main guy. He's the Lord and Saviour, and whom Christians believe is the human incarnation of the God who created us all. So unfortunately, in terms of what Jesus said and did, when it comes to gender identity and trans people, he didn't have a lot to say. So we don't have a lot to go on. So on the one hand, that's a great thing. On the other hand, not so great. I guess Christianity and the many different denominations of this faith community that exist in the world today have a long-standing history of interpreting the words and actions of Jesus in lots of different ways. So next slide, please. There are those that take historical context into account, and there are those that interpret things literally, and both are okay. There's a diversity of interpretation regarding just about every human issue ever, and that definitely includes gender. What we do know, and what most Christian communities agree upon, is that for Jesus, loving and respecting each other as human beings was something he advocated for above all else. The command, love your neighbour as you would want to be loved yourself, comes second only to loving God, and this is a core belief at the heart of the Christian faith. Jesus spoke about this love, respect, and compassion for those around us, and during his time with us on earth, he embodied this in everything he did. So one of the verses that exemplifies this is in John chapter 13. A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. So as Christians, we are called to embody this too. And when we consider from an inclusive point of view what living out this example that Jesus has set for us looks like, it means providing an accepting and safe space for everyone to come to know him, to build relationships with others and feel part of a community, and affording the same kinds of opportunities to serve God to every member, regardless of their gender identity. And we are also taught, as I said earlier, that Jesus wants everybody to have a direct relationship with him. And this is solely between that person and Jesus. So it is not then our place to judge that relationship or enforce our personal interpretation of what that relationship or that person's life should look like. So totally by chance, I came across a clip of US Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's a Christian and describes herself as a woman of faith. She was defending the rights of LGBTQ people in the US court earlier this year, and she explained that Christianity is often weaponized to justify bigotry, when in fact, after quoting the Love Thy Neighbor verse that I mentioned before, she stated that all people in the eyes of Jesus are holy and sacred in an unconditional sense, and it is not up to us to love parts of people, but all people. So there are other parts of the Bible and verses we can cite that affirm this inclusive view that calls to remove all human judgment from our priorities. So on the next slide, there's a couple of examples that I often return to, and particularly this one in Galatians. It states, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. So this verse arguably challenges the assumptions that race, nationality, sex, or gender is relevant when it comes to belonging to the Christian church, and it emphasizes that we are all one and equal in Jesus' eyes. So, can you be trans and be a Christian? Next slide, please. Yes, absolutely, is my answer to that. So, moving on, I guess there are two myths that I think sometimes prevent trans people from reaching out or returning to the Christian faith that I want to briefly address here. So with particular reference to what the Church of England as a denomination has to say, because this is a denomination that this country and around the world, they take into account quite a bit. So the first point is trans people cannot be baptized into the Christian faith, which, as I was saying before, is quite a key component of the Christian faith and happens in many different ways in different parts of the church. So the Church of England themselves published official pastoral guidance in 2018, stating that if a trans person is not already baptized, then baptism itself would be the natural liturgical context for recognizing and celebrating that trans person's identity in Christ. Where such a person has already been baptized, a bit like me, the House of Bishops commends the rite of affirmation of baptismal faith as a central feature of any service to recognise a person's gender transition and potential change of name. So there's already existing liturgy surrounding renaming ceremonies in the Christian faith, which echo God's intentions in the Bible when he renamed those with a renewed faith and purpose. People like Sarah and Saul. So new names aren't new, essentially, in the Christian faith. And the second myth that I want to address is that trans people aren't acknowledged by their church or their leaders. Actually, so moving on to the next slide, as we can see, trans people have always existed and exist now in reality and have participated within the life and growth of the Christian faith. There are active trans priests, readers, and academics in the church who live authentically and fully serve Christ. The first trans priest was ordained in the Church of England in 2005, I think, and more have followed in her footsteps. So there are a few suggestions I wanted to make for Christian communities to think about and work towards in order to make their communities as inclusive and welcoming to trans people as possible. So moving on to the next slide, I've come up with just a few. One of them is to make space for trans people in Christian traditions and ceremonies. So the things I've mentioned, renaming ceremonies, affirmations of faith, all of these positive things that then renew that person's identity and their relationship with God as a trans person. Things, very practical things. Think about your church, your community building. Would a trans person feel welcome? Do they have toilets they can access, as Jonathan mentioned before? Do they have access to that right in a welcoming space? And encourage the practice of maybe asking newcomers their pronouns, just to remove the stigma around asking somebody about their gender and making that a really welcoming space for them. The third point I raised, I think is the most important, is listen to trans people, learn from and appreciate their experiences, but also be responsible for educating yourselves. So ensure that your leaders, your leadership team are as well informed about trans issues, both theologically and pastorally, as they can be. Find, make available and distribute LGBTQ resources to the rest of your congregation and community, and be open to facilitating explorative but respectful conversations with those that want them. So moving on to the next slide, I just compiled basically existing spaces that already exist for LGBTQ Christians, and those are a few that you can look into that are all online. And rather than going into too much detail here, they have all the resources and all the information that you could access to kind of equip yourself and equip your church. Moving on to the next slide. A couple more resources. So the Student Christian Movement have lots of diverse and inclusive resources. One Body, One Faith, which is the LGBTQ Christian movement in the UK, which was founded back in 1976, so it's been around a while. They also have a wealth of accessible resources on the website too. And I definitely recommend looking at their list of visible churches. So if you belong to a church and you want to make a statement or clarify that you are welcoming to trans Christians and LGBTQ Christians as a whole, you can apply to put yourself on that visible churches list, so that trans people like me, who I'd also encourage, who would look on that list and see if there's a church in their area that might be welcoming to them, you would be visible on that list. And it just kind of helps people get over that barrier of taking the first step into a church, which can always be a bit scary. The link to the guidance about baptism liturgy for trans people is on there, and if anybody wants to see the clip that I mentioned earlier, that's on there too. So basically, there's a wealth of resources out there, and if you're open to exploring Christianity, but gender identity is something that's maybe holding you back from exploring further, then you aren't alone. Thank you for listening to me today, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions later.
Thank you so much, Alec. It was especially cool to hear all the specific advice that you have for Christian communities. That's something that people actually could take forward. Okay, so again, any questions, make sure you post them in the comments. Our final speaker today is Hannah Rose. Hannah Rose is an Iraqi queer trans woman of color who was raised traditionally Muslim and is now finding her own way around Islam. She currently works as an LGBT plus event producer and an activist in London, particularly focusing on the needs of other trans POC. So welcome, Hannah.
Hey, thank you so much, Rakaya, and thank you to Alec for that amazing presentation on Christianity, and of course to Pride Inside for hosting us all here. And so today I wanted to take the time to talk about trans people in Islam and to address some common misconceptions and to give a few guidelines and resources on how to be a better ally. But first, I wanted to talk a bit about myself and why you should even listen to me. So I grew up in a very strict Muslim household with my parents and siblings. And this, like for many others, started causing problems as I grew up, and my values didn't perfectly align with those of my parents, especially because even as a kid, I was a lot more effeminate than my peers. And this just got especially bad when my parents found out that I was trans. I wouldn't have ever dreamed of actually coming out to them, but they looked through my room once while I was asleep and found my therapist's letter detailing my problems with dysphoria. And as you can imagine, that didn't go well, especially when they discovered that I was already on hormones. I was 16 at the time, but my father threatened to kill me and then threw me out. So for a while after that, I kind of resented everything connected to Islam. But after managing to run away to the UK and talking to other queer Muslims, I managed to form my own relationship and interpretation of the religion so that it could be right for me and my life. So first of all, can you even be Muslim and trans? Doesn't the Quran or the Hadith say that or this against it? And yes, you absolutely can be. We cannot judge anyone else. That is solely Allah's jurisdiction. Can we also get the slides on the screen? Next one, please. Thank you. One of the most fundamental things Allah has taught us is that we should do no harm. But by shunning trans people and acting as if there's something inherently wrong with us, a lot of us receive long-lasting harm from that kind of abuse and treatment. This especially doesn't make sense, as gender non-conforming Muslims have a long history in Islam. Back then, they were described as muhanath, that means effeminate ones, and the people who we now describe as GNC, trans, or gay. Prophet Muhammad's wife, Salama, had a close muhanath friend who was always welcome in their home. And also in recent history, there have been multiple Islamic cultures that have accepted trans or third gender individuals, such as the Hijra, who were tasked with protecting royalty throughout the 16th to 19th century, or the Khwaja who were held in high esteem before the colonization in Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, which is a common theme in a lot of other countries, that it was a lot better for trans and queer people before colonization. And finally, Allah made us what we are. By criticizing his work as flawed, one would directly be criticizing him. Now I want to talk a bit more directly about how other Muslims can be more inclusive of trans people, and maybe even push our mosques to be more inclusive. Obviously, it's a bit more difficult for us, since a lot of mosques are very gender segregated. But the simplest way is to just create a welcoming environment for trans people, which can be achieved by just offering your support to a trans friend in need, to listen to them about the issues they're facing, and to educate yourself about their struggles in your own time. Even when they're not around, you should be advocating for trans rights and things like correct pronoun usage. You could maybe even talk about adding policies for how to treat trans people who are transitioning in your local mosque. Lastly, I wanted to show you all some resources. Could we move 2 slides forward? Thank you. So here are some resources for Muslims or allies that might want to learn more about our faith. The Sublime Quran is an amazing read. It's an interpretation of the Quran by an American feminist. Since the Quran was written in 7th century Arabic, there are many, many interpretations one could take from it. So that's not a language anyone speaks anymore. And this is one of the more progressive interpretations. And for organizations, we have groups like Inclusive Mosque and Iman UK. We've got their websites right there, who host events and give out support, information of all kinds, mostly centered around London. But Hadaya offers monthly events in most large English and Scottish cities, in addition to many other things like a WhatsApp group, a mentoring scheme, a support hotline, and much, much more. Muslims for Progressive Values is one of the best sources for all kinds of information regarding Islam and hosts a variety of talks, websites, and organizations all around the world. If you were to only check out one of these websites, I definitely recommend MPV. Thank you all so much again, and thank you to Pride Inside for hosting us here, and I'll give back to Rakaya.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was really incredible. I find it really amazing to hear from other trans Muslims, and thanks for signposting IMI, Inclusive Mosque, because I know for me that going to an LGBT event with them a few years ago was just like a huge, impactful thing in my life that really changed my experience with Islam. Okay, so we're going to be moving on to questions. Okay, so I have one that is for everybody. So if we could go through in the order that we spoke in. What are your feelings? How do you feel about the future of trans inclusion in your faith spaces?
Should I go first then?
Yes, please.
Okay. It's interesting, and I think as kind of the media kind of doubles down on trans people, it's going to be a lot harder, and I guess we're going to have a lot more difficult conversations. But I think especially in my faith space, we've just started an LGBT network, as we've said. And I think kind of that getting together a group of committed people who are actually really committed to having these difficult conversations, spreading resources, signposting people. I think having allies and building allies within our faith spaces is going to be really important because, as we know, we're kind of really tired at the moment and we can't do everything by ourselves. So I think that's kind of the way we can do that, especially in my synagogue.
Lovely. Alec?
Yeah, I'd kind of echo what Jonathan said, really. I think that the more allies we have in Christian spaces, and the more people that are willing to be educated about what it's like to live as a trans person and to be trans in a faith space, the more we will kind of advance and become more inclusive. Because I think a lot of the fear and confusion stems from people not understanding what a trans person's experiences are, and even just a basic understanding of sex and gender. There's so many misconceptions, I think, in the world, and I think that potentially the more people educate themselves, particularly in faith spaces that have such an amazing potential to be supportive and inclusive, the better, really. I think we're heading in the right direction, but I think it's going to take a lot of concerted effort. Events like these only help. So yeah, I think we're heading in the right direction. It's good to be optimistic, I think.
Lovely. And Hannah?
Yeah, I think we have a long way to go with Muslim spaces regarding equality, but I do think places like Inclusive Mosque are going to start popping up more and more. I know some more traditional mosques here, at least in London, and places like the Bay Area and San Francisco in America are getting a lot more inclusive than they were even like 3 years ago. So I think we've got a very hopeful way to go. Which we maybe could just start by accepting more trans people into more traditional mosques.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Okay, so what would you say each of you, is the most affirming experience you've had as a trans person in a faith community space? Jonathan?
It was definitely last year when I finally got around to getting my gender recognition certificate, which I transitioned when I was 16. I'm 28 now. It's been 12 years, and I only did it last year. If that doesn't tell you something about the gender recognition certificate process. Anyway, I digress. But I had a really nice experience being called up to the Bima, which is the central place where we read the Torah, and one of the rabbis at my synagogue kind of explained kind of some of my journey, what this meant to me, and I was able to give a blessing over the Torah, and actually people were crying, and I think it was really meaningful for people to see that kind of outward expression of, we're celebrating you at this massive trans life moment, and it was just like very holy as well, and people were kind of amazed that it had happened, and I guess this kind of paves the way for more trans people to have these experiences too.
Amazing. Alec?
Wow, that sounds incredible. Sorry, I'm still dwelling in how amazing that must have been, Jonathan. I guess the most affirming, or the best experience for me as a trans Christian was probably when I attended London Pride, talking maybe 2-3 years ago now, and I remember. I wasn't involved in the Pride March itself, but I remember being on the side and watching Christians at Pride walk past, watching people from all different faiths and faith communities walking in the Pride March, and that was just so. I was speechless, absolutely speechless, because I'd never seen. I didn't even know that there were so many allies, that there were so many people that were from faith communities that also belonged to the LGBTQ community. And I guess becoming more involved in online faith spaces has also opened my eyes, just to know that there's other people out there that have experienced the same things but are still finding a way to hold on to their faith. That was a massive kind of very visual representation of, you're not on your own, and there's loads of other people like you experiencing the same things. So yeah, that was a really cool experience.
Amazing, thanks. Hannah?
I also agree. Like moving to London and seeing spaces like Inclusive Mosque just opened my eyes so much, because I grew up in a very white world, and the only parts that weren't very white were places like my mosque and my more like Iraqi communities, but those were always very, very traditional and very restrictive. So mosque for me had never felt like an activity I enjoyed. It's something my parents forced me to go to. It's something where I just met opposition to my existence, where people opposed the way I wanted to live my life and the way I wanted to be. But then coming here to London and attending an inclusive mosque and being given this freedom of, you don't have to pray if you don't want to. You can do whatever you want. You can believe what you want. You can be who you want in this Muslim space. And no one is going to tell you, no, that is sinful, that is wrong.
Yeah, that's so powerful. Thank you, Hannah. So if we were to think about what we've been a lot of us have been led to believe that being queer is a sin, and I know a lot of people of faith can often reconcile being queer or being trans as, okay, well, this is sinful, but I'm going to accept that it's a sin and carry on with my life and still be of faith and so on. And for me, that was I think that's a very damaging situation to live in. And for me, it was a big deal to change that when I heard an imam say this isn't how to do it. It's absolutely fine. It's not sinful. It's fine to be who you are. So what are your experiences of that? Jonathan?
I think, especially with the movement that I'm part of, which is conservative, not conservative as in Tory, conservative as in the Jewish movement. We like to kind of take halakha, which is Jewish law, but move it into a modern context. It doesn't mean abandoning the past, but it means that we recognize that in each generation, Torah moves on, and we need to bring our whole selves into the Jewish texts and Jewish scriptures. So you can't stay in the past. You need to transpose these laws into modern life, and some just don't work. And some need to be reinterpreted if people are going to bring their whole selves into faith spaces. So within that movement, the conservative movement has made great strides on LGBT issues and have sanctioned same-sex marriage a couple of years ago. So you can still definitely be traditional, but also be progressive too.
Great, thanks. Alec?
Yeah, I mean, just to say really quickly, this isn't something that I think any Christian is able to solve by themselves. And I think, as I said in kind of the short presentation, there's a lot of discrepancies between how people interpret the Bible, how people interpret what Jesus said and what Jesus did, and a lot of that, unfortunately, has, you know, there's been a lot of negative backlash around queer Christians, and that for me, I can't understand where a lot of that comes from, but I guess it's about opening up conversations as to how people read the words and interpret it themselves, and kind of, I think there's a lot of power behind the stance it's okay to disagree in Christian spaces, and whilst that's not the most helpful way to describe things, I think we are still in the process of having conversations about what it means to be a queer Christian, and almost we need to have those conversations alongside being genuinely inclusive and opening up inclusive spaces.
Wonderful. Hannah?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's a very common viewpoint, also with like non-queer faith people. So it's okay that you're gay. It's a sin, but that's okay. I think that's inherently problematic because it's still viewing our existence as something that we should be ashamed of, or something that we're only doing because we have to. While I want to be proudly queer, I want to be proudly myself. And I think it also originates from the issue that a lot of transphobia, in my belief, actually is rooted in a lot of misogyny too. So the thought process of, oh, why would you want to become a woman? That make you worse, or why would you become a man? You can't do that. You're a woman. You can't choose to become a man. You can't go up. That doesn't make sense. And I think a lot of our issues are rooted in that kind of misogynistic thinking.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we've come to the end now. So just to finish off, I want to say that I think that something that we want anyone watching to see is that there are lots and lots of people who are trans and of faith, and we are here, and I think it's often ignored and easy to ignore, but we would ask that you, as an ally, would stand up and say something, because it's only within the community on a grassroots level that these things are going to change, like in your local church or synagogue or mosque, that things are going to change. And if no one's going to stand up and say anything, particularly allies who can do it more safely than we can, then things aren't going to change. So I think that that's what we would love to ask of you. So I want to say thank you to all of the people who've spoken today. I think you'll agree they've all been amazing and inspiring. I wasn't prepared for the emotions between speaking to each one of hearing what everyone had to say. And I want to say a big thank you to Max for being an amazing interpreter for the event. That's been incredible. And to Amnesty UK for giving us this opportunity to share our experience of being trans people in faith. It's such an important conversation that isn't had enough, and hopefully it's going to happen more. So thank you everyone for listening, and enjoy the rest of your day.